So remember that our body has trillions of cells within it, and so it's critically important to coordinate the activity of all of those cells so that they are working together efficiently. In order to do this, our body maintains a very specific set of internal conditions so that it can work without failure. This is why the plasma membrane of our cells and the integumentary system as a whole is very important. So if we're going to maintain internal conditions, we have to separate internal from external. So the plasma membrane helps to separate the internal environment of the cell from the external environment. And the integumentary system is the organ system that functions to keep the internal environment of our body separate from the external world. So let's examine now how the body maintains those stable internal conditions. And so the term homeostasis refers to these stable internal conditions, even though the outside world is changing continuously. So I'm going to explain homeostasis graphically, because homeostasis can be viewed as a narrow range around a set point. So we have time on our horizontal axis here, and some variable, such as body temperature, on our vertical axis. Our body sets our resting normal body temperature at about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. This is what the horizontal purple dashed line represents. However, our body does not always have to be at exactly 98.6 Fahrenheit in order to be in homeostasis. There is a little bit of normal fluctuation above or below 98.6 Fahrenheit. So that is what the blue range surrounding the line represents. Our normal body temperature can be anywhere within this blue shaded region. Our home thermostats maintain the homeostasis of our houses or our apartments. So of course, we can set the thermostat at a desired temperature. The furnace will turn on if the temperature of our living space falls below that set temperature, or the air conditioning will turn on if the temperature of our living space rises higher than that set point. So let's assume that it is summertime and we have the air conditioning set at 72 degrees Fahrenheit. When the thermostat detects that the temperature of the house has risen above the set point of 72 degrees, the air conditioning will turn on and it's going to begin to cool the house. So at some point, the air conditioner will cool the house below 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that point, the thermostat will tell the air conditioner to turn off. This cycle is going to continue to repeat in order to keep our house cool. So we've seen that homeostasis is a balance within a very narrow range. And we're also going to see that external factors and external variables, such as temperature, are going to try to disrupt that balance. So we find that there are 5 factors that influence homeostasis of a particular variable. So that is, these 5 factors work together in order to restore that initial balance of homeostasis. The variable can be anything occurring within the body, so such as CO2 levels in the bloodstream, body temperature, and also blood glucose levels are good examples of these variables. The stimulus, the first of our 5 factors, is the change in the variable, so such as a change in body temperature or blood glucose levels that brings the body out of balance. Receptors are structures in the body that detect these changes or these stimuli. So next, the sensory input pathway is going to send information to a control center for that particular variable. So the receptor is simply informing the control center that a change has occurred. The input pathway is also referred to as the afferent pathway. So think of this as information that is approaching the control center. So the control center will then issue an appropriate response to the initial stimulus. These are the output commands that travel by way of an efferent pathway out of the control center. And think of efferent pathways as information that is exiting the control center. And this output from the control center is sent to what is called an effector. And the effector is a structure that's going to carry out the body's response to that particular stimulus. So for instance, if the initial stimulus was cold air, then the effector would be skeletal muscles that are going to shiver in response to the cold in order to generate more body heat. And so finally, the effector, as we just saw, is going to carry out the body's response to that initial stimulus. The response is going to then feed back to reduce the effect of that initial stimulus on the body. Feedback mechanisms, as we'll see in a moment, can be either positive or negative, and we'll examine both and give some examples of where these feedback mechanisms are going to occur in the body. So first we'll begin with negative feedback mechanisms, and the term negative implies that the initial stimulus and the body's response to that stimulus are in opposite directions. So if the stimulus increases some variable, the body's response will be to decrease it. On the other hand, if that initial stimulus is going to decrease some variable, the body's response will be to increase it. So we see that the initial stimulus and the response are always going to be in opposite directions with negative feedback mechanisms. The purpose of a negative feedback mechanism is to prevent a big change from occurring and keep the body at an established set point. Negative feedback mechanisms are going to be the most common of the homeostasis feedback mechanisms that we're going to encounter in the body. So let's look at a few examples here. So we briefly mentioned one negative feedback mechanism, the regulation of body temperature. However, let's explore that in a little bit more detail and give what we have learned about give a little bit more detail about what we have learned about those 5 factors that control homeostasis. So in this diagram, we have 2 stimuli. We have heat and we have cold. So high or low external temperatures will threaten our homeostasis. That is, they will threaten the homeostasis of our normal body temperature. And they are either going to increase or decrease our body temperature beyond that typical 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So in both examples, temperature-sensitive receptors that are located within the skin and within the brain will detect these changes in body temperature. They will communicate through the afferent pathway with a control center in the brain. The control center will then select an appropriate response to the stimulus and send that information to effectors through the efferent pathway. If the initial stimulus was high external temperatures, so for example on a warm day, the effector that will be activated are sweat glands, and these sweat glands will cause us to perspire and cool our body. If the initial stimulus was cold external temperatures on a cold day, the effector that would be activated are skeletal muscles, and these would cause us to shiver and our muscles to generate additional body heat. Another example of negative feedback mechanisms is rising blood glucose after a meal, and the maintenance of blood glucose after a meal by hormones. So when we consume food, our digestive system is going to break down the food that we eat and absorb it into the bloodstream. And one of the main fuels that we get from consuming foods is a carbohydrate called glucose. And when blood glucose begins to rise after a meal, a gland called the pancreas is stimulated to release a hormone called insulin. And insulin will stimulate most cells in the body to take up glucose from the blood. We also see that insulin will stimulate the liver to take up glucose from the bloodstream and store it as a starch called glycogen. So as the body cells and the liver take up glucose from the bloodstream, this is going to cause blood glucose levels to fall back down and decline to their typical levels before we consumed that meal. So on the other hand, positive feedback mechanisms are described as self-amplifying cycles. In positive feedback mechanisms, the stimulus and the response are in the same direction. And the purpose of these mechanisms is to create big changes temporarily within the body. We'll look at 2 examples of positive feedback mechanisms, blood clotting and childbirth. We'll start with blood clotting first. So blood clotting is the process that occurs when a break or a tear in a blood vessel is detected. Its function is to create a seal in the blood vessel so that bleeding will stop. So small cellular fragments that are in the bloodstream, called platelets, will become activated when they are in close proximity to a break in a blood vessel. They will release chemical messengers that are going to recruit other platelets to the wound site. Additional platelets that are attracted to the site will release those chemicals as well, and in turn that's going to recruit even more platelets to the site. And eventually the platelets are going to form a plug that starts to grow in size as more and more of these platelets are brought to this wound site. So once the platelet plug is large enough to seal up the wound, the feedback cycle of the recruiting platelets is broken, and that's when the positive feedback cycle will end. So childbirth is another example of a positive feedback mechanism or a positive feedback cycle. Toward the end of pregnancy, the baby's head is going to push on a region of the uterus called the cervix. And the cervix is extremely sensitive to these stimuli, and that information is then passed to the brain. So here the brain is going to stimulate a gland called the pituitary gland, which is a small but very important endocrine gland that's located at the base of the brain. And that pituitary gland is going to release a hormone called oxytocin into the bloodstream. So increases in oxytocin concentration will stimulate the contractions of the muscle that's found in the walls of the uterus. These contractions are then going to push the baby even harder against the cervix and begin the cycle again. So this will repeat and continue until the contractions of the uterus are strong enough and frequent enough that they will lead to childbirth. The two organ systems that control homeostasis in the body are the nervous system and the endocrine system. They both accomplish this in slightly different ways. The nervous system is going to create and release chemical messengers called neurotransmitters that will stimulate cells and tissues directly. On the other hand, the endocrine system is going to create and release chemical messengers into the bloodstream that are called hormones. And once these hormones are released into the bloodstream, they're going to stimulate their target cells or target tissues to respond to that initial stimulus. So to finish this particular segment on homeostasis, I have a question that I would like to pose to you. And that question is that when we become dehydrated, we become thirsty. And this is going to drive us to drink fluids. So on the basis of what we now know about control systems, I want you to decide whether the thirst sensation is part of a negative feedback mechanism or a positive feedback control mechanism, and use some evidence to defend your choice. What I will do in Moodle is I will open up a forum for this question so that you may submit your responses and I can give you feedback on those responses. And this forum will be located in proximity to the link for that first lab report in Lab 1.